your thoughts on it kind of as we jump over into that projection as we move through the show would be that he's demonstrated this less than Rashid Shaheed. And having demonstrated it, I mean, Shaheed had multiple big scoring games a season ago and demonstrated a lot of dynamism as a rookie as well. And so they're very different in terms of what they've already demonstrated at the NFL level. And yet, Tolbert to me has the type of profile and the type of situation that if he sticks as a guy who gets routes in 2024, he's a much less expensive way to get that profile and that scoring level than Shaheed is at this point.
I love that note. I think there's typically always cheaper ways to get into the can't really earn targets. It's a spike week deep threat profile. And Shaheed's particularly efficient in each of his first two seasons, but he just doesn't, from what I understand from the film watchers and from everything else, like doesn't have the crispness to his routes, doesn't do a lot of the stuff underneath, is just purely a deep threat, is really good as a deep threat.
And one of the other mild concerns I would have for him as a true breakout guy would be that he played at a small school and his claim to fame there was as a returner. And that doesn't mean you can't get better. And I think he's already demonstrated plenty at the NFL level to show that he's not like just a returner. But if you looked at these two guys and their college profiles, there's no question who was the far, far better player. Now, again, I'm not saying you want to weight that more than the new information we have, which is at the NFL level and is more recent. But we want to think through what the background for these guys is beyond just the NFL.
And when you say there's no question, you mean Tolbert was the better player
Right.
as a receiving prospect. Shaheed, as an NFL player, been great, but important to note that with his really strong yards per out run to date in his career, that is really heavily on the yards per target side. It's not as high on the targets per out run side. His target earning has been pretty average, 18.1%, 16.5%. For a deep threat, it's solid. But it's the fact that he's run double-digit yards per target figures both seasons, and he averages like 12 yards per target for the 2 years, that has really elevated him. And one of the things is you live by the deep shot, you die by the deep shot a little bit. There's guys that have looked like this. Mecole Hardman looked like this the first couple of years of his career. Not to say that Rashid Shaheed's going to turn to Mecole Hardman, but you can run these really high yards per targets because you catch a lot of the deep targets in a smaller sample, and then the next year you just stop catching them. And you're like, oh, well, there's just nothing there at that point. Like, well, not nothing there, but it's a lot harder, right? You need one of the things that I was talking to you a little bit about when I was doing the Niners projection and really enjoyed looking at it. As we talk to the Saints, it's a good one, but you need targets at all depths to really hit ceiling. And we've talked about this with so many players over the years. It's one of the stealing banana staples that we go back to. We talked about it with Stephon Diggs when he came from the Vikings to the Bills, that the two previous seasons he had the underneath role, really low ADOT role in like 2018 in Minnesota and racked up a ton of target volume and was good in that role. And then the next year, 2019, they basically made him a pure deep threat, and he had a 2+ yards per out run as a pure deep threat, earned less volume, really high ADOT. Typically, the receiver owns their ADOT. You don't see a guy's ADOT bounce around like Diggs was at this time. I actually have his profile up right now. 2018, he was a 9.8 ADOT, sub 10, yards on average of depth, which was weird for him to that point. The next year, 2019, 15.6. I mean, he's up there in the Rashid Shaheed realm of just pure deep threat. And he runs a 2.69 yards per route run that season. He's massively efficient as a deep threat. We talked about how, and then in 2020, he goes on to be a player for the Bills who does stuff at all depths, and he had shown that ability. It was exciting to see, but you don't really get the monster fantasy points. Even though he had the 2.69 yards per out run in 2019, he didn't smash in fantasy for the Vikings that year. He smashed in 2020 when the targets per route run elevated because he was getting the volume at all depths. DJ Moore's another player we've talked about, been pigeonholed at times. Started to get that a little bit more in Chicago last year, the true alpha targets at all depths type of profile. It's something, when I mentioned the Niners, we've talked about with Deebo Samuel before, when he's at the really low ADOT and just the manufactured touches, he can accumulate a lot of stats, but it's really nice those seasons like 2021 when he busted out where he gets some air yards. Once Debo starts to get some vertical passes, the profile explodes. And the reason I mentioned it being interesting for the Niners is Ayuk is sort of the inverse. He has a 14 plus ADOT last year and doesn't get to enough targets, even though he's hyper efficient, to where it's tough to justify a second round ADP on him unless you start to see some scenarios where that ADOT comes down and he moves into shallower targets. I would suggest that that's difficult for Ayuk, but all of that discussion goes back to the Saints, who you just alluded to us wanting to discuss a little bit. When I went through the projections for the Saints, it was noticeable that there's something has to happen in the shallow area of the field. Michael Thomas is gone. He still earned volume last year. We just talked about Rashid Shaheed being a deep threat only. A.T. Perry is their third receiver, also had a really high ADOT as a rookie last year, used vertically. Maybe that's not the only way they would use him. They do have Alvin Kamara underneath. They do have Juwan Johnson, who's now hurt and likely to be back for week 1, but not a certainty. But I think what's very clear is if you start to look at the Chris Olave profile through 2 years, that his ADOT needs to come down. It started at 14.9 as a rookie. It was 13.9 the next year. He earns targets on over 25% of his routes both years at these really high ADOTs. It's a really strong weighted targets per out run profile, but the efficiency hasn't been there because he hasn't had quarterbacks that have been particularly good at throwing these deep balls. I talked about how you live by the deep ball, you die by the deep ball. The catch rates haven't been there, all that stuff. He has only an 8.1 yards per target last year. I was talking about the depth adjusted yards per target and racer type stats. That would look bad. An 8.1 yards per target on a 13.9 ADOT is not impressive. And yet the volume earning on those roles is impressive. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that Chris Olave is good. He backed up the ability to be a dominant number 1 target after he did that as a rookie, really, right out of the gate on a per route basis and all of those things. And now when I did my projection for the Saints this year, it was very easy for me to envision Chris Olave's ADOT continuing to fall. Went from 14.9 in his rookie year to 13.9, I mentioned. But under a new offensive coordinator, new coaching staff, that it's like, look, we got to get this guy the ball in the short and intermediate range of the field. We got to fill out his target tree. We need him. He's our best route runner. He's our best player. There's no question. We need him catching passes in high percentage areas and getting the vertical looks as well, which he will almost certainly retain. I projected his ADOT to fall, quite significantly from these first 2 years, despite the fact that he has a sample of nearly 1,000 routes, and he's been a 2+ yards per out run guy both of his first 2 years. Has been very good in this role. That's been a little more vertical than I think people probably realize, because we don't necessarily think of Olave as just a pure deep threat, but it's been just massive air yards for him. We have talked about him on air yards terms quite a bit. I think we see his ADOT fall. I think he keeps the raw air yards, but he sees more targets in the shallow and intermediate range with Michael Thomas now gone. I understand that a lot of people think Michael Thomas is just terrible at this point, but he was still a pretty significant part of this offense last year. You also have Taysom Hill factoring into the short area. And he's aging and could eventually miss some time or what have you. But Thomas had 64 targets in 10 games last year, 6.4 per game. Still a very meaningful number of targets. That projects out to about at least 100 target pace. And that was a guy operating at a lower ADOT that is no longer in the offense. I think you see Olave move down into that, which would cause his catch rate to rise. Those are a lot more catchable balls. It might bring his yards per target or his expected yards per target down a little bit, but he's an efficient player. I think he would earn plenty of volume per route. That number could even spike. I mentioned even in a deep role, he was at 25 plus. He could be a 30% targets per out run player if he starts to get more manufactured and short looks, first read, quick slants, what have you. I'm not certain that will happen, but I do believe when you go into the projection and you look at the Saints, that's a very interesting problem. Who's going to get what? Because Derek Carr has actually not been a quarterback that carries really, really high ADOTs. He likes to throw underneath a decent amount as well. Somebody's got to catch a lot of targets underneath. Last year, Kamara caught a ton. But Kamara is getting older too. His efficiency numbers don't look great. Missed tackles, force per touch, all that stuff doesn't look efficient anymore. Doesn't look efficient in the pass game. doesn't look efficient as a runner, really. If you really dig into the advanced metrics, they need answers in the short area of the field. And the very logical answer that I assume when I do the projection is they're going to do is to get Chris Olave more unlocked as a true number one, and then operate with Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry and those other players over the top of him. But I mentioned to you, I was looking at the rest of the depth chart. Like Cedric Wilson, they signed and they gave a little bit of guaranteed money to. And I was like, I mean, his profile looks a little bit more like Michael Thomas's, certainly than Rashid Shaheed and A.T. Perry. Maybe Cedric Wilson is a guy who winds up running some of these more shallow and intermediate routes. I don't know. Seems like Olave has an opportunity, though, to really explode in year 3.
He does. And I've been drafting him pretty aggressively. I don't always do it because I want to get some exposure to Marvin Harrison, but I do think that Olave should be ahead of the rookie there. This depth chart is absolutely fascinating, and I think it'll be one of the most interesting passing games to follow, even if it doesn't end up to be one of the most interesting passing games in terms of actual production. But I mean, Derek Carr has had, such a weird career and has been with, some coordinators like John Gruden who unlocked him, at stretches. He I think, notoriously, at least from my perspective, was in those offenses where they were asking him to throw all of these deep sideline shots to Amari Cooper. And, this is years removed at this point, but that almost ruined both of their careers. You look at the SIS numbers for last season, and they're pretty startling because I think you can make a strong argument that this stuff is on Shaheed, it's on Olave as opposed to Carr. But Carr actually had the 4th best IQR on deep targets last year, so passes that went 15 plus yards, and he was about 10th in total attempts at those depths. So in no way, shape, or form am I saying that you want to load up on Derek Carr. And his volume, I think, is going to limit him. But one of the reasons that we have him on our dynasty roster is I do think that he's one of these guys who's subtly been like very, very mildly undervalued, and that perhaps the vertical passing attack can support some other things. But Ben, for the reason that you mentioned Cedric Wilson, I have no idea where they're going to get those underneath targets from, because Olave is, a bit of a deep guy. You go back and look at his profile at Ohio State, and after you had sent me your original notes, I was like, can he do the intermediate depths? Will he be able to unlock that Stephon Diggs type of profile? And I think that he possibly can, because you look at 2021, and so 2020, 2021, 2022, Olave is good in that Ohio State offense every year. The 2020 and 2022, his ADOT is very deep and he's successful, but for the reasons that you mentioned, the yardage isn't exactly there for someone who then went to the NFL and was immediately as good as he was, right? You look at that final season, in part because JSN is stepping on the volume for both Wilson and Olave. That 2021 season, he does have the ADOT drop. He has easily his most yards per game. That's what we're kind of looking for him to do at the NFL level this year. My concern would be that he was always somebody who doesn't really do anything with the ball in his hands. And so wherever he catches the ball, it's not that you're going to get 0 yards after the catch. You're going to obviously get some yards after the catch. But when you contrast him to both of his teammates there at Ohio State, as an example, and in theory, those guys are very good players, but a lot less in terms of both evading tackles and then also a lot less in terms of actually gaining the after contact yardage. So there may be an element where a team's like, well, I mean, what he does well is get deep. And so that's really where we want him to thrive. The problem is that that's where Shaheed is also very, very good, right? And you look at him, 58% snaps last year, 75% routes. You mentioned the target earning on a per route basis, not great. The thing I think that maybe is a little bit of a red flag for me, I mean, he gets injured more or less right after Michael Thomas does. And so you don't get to see what he might have done if he had stayed healthy in that offense and it was just him and Olave. But he comes back, the routes spike in week 16, but then they drop again in week 17 and 18. Now, one of the things that was kind of funny is that the three of them, Olave, Perry, and Shaheed, combined for like 9 catches on 10 targets for almost 200 yards and 4 touchdowns last year against the Falcons. It was very much an embarrassing final game for that Falcons group there. But all of these guys,
Smith.
there's so much overlap in terms of what the interesting players on the Saints could potentially do, right? Because when you get that big game in week 18 from A.T. Perry, you're like, okay, well, I mean, this guy was not drafted to necessarily come out and immediately do it. When you have a big week 18 spike week, you're thinking, well, that opens the door a little bit. And this is a guy who in 2021, you're talking about 1,293 yards, 15 touchdowns, 2.5 yards per team attempt, a 34% dominator rating, a 15 ADOT. And then he backs that up in 2022 with over 1,000 yards and 11 more touchdowns. I mean, this is a guy in his final 2 years in college scores 26 touchdowns, right? He's 6'3", 198, had a 96th percentile broad jump. Pickens and Lamb are among his athletic comps. I mean, again, you're talking about another vertical player. Well, what did they then add in the draft? You get Bub Means, who, again, not drafted to come in and provide immediate production. But this is a kind of intriguing name here where if you look exclusively at 20-plus air yard targets a season ago, he was third in the college football behind Odunze and Devontae Walker in terms of air yards he earned specifically on deep targets. He was third in the prospect group in ADOT. He was solid in yards per team attempt. Not good, but solid, despite their starting quarterback averaging 5.2 adjusted net yards per attempt. The quarterback, I don't even know for sure he was the starter. Their quarterback who got the most passing attempts last year had more interceptions than touchdowns. You got a guy with a 4.43 and a 39-inch vertical at 212 pounds. You've got Chris Godwin and DJ Moore in his athletic comps. These guys are long shots, but the point is that they actually have a ton of overlap on people who could potentially run go routes. And
yeah, like you
again,
just described a vertical receiver. You know, how does he fit into this offense?
Yeah, so they got 4 guys who can.
They're just going to run sprints. 5 deep routes every play. You've heard of 4-verts. This is the first 5-verts exclusive offense.
So I guess I would have a little bit of concern that my extremely optimistic thesis for Olave might get, covered up a little bit by his teammates also excelling there. And then, just Derek Carr dropping back and being like, where is the person that I throw the ball to as an outlet? And I've been very bearish on Juwan Johnson, but yeah, maybe that's not right. I mean, maybe if he comes back healthy and you're like, you need someone to stand out there across the line of scrimmage, 10 yards down the field and just be an outlet.
He's totally free. I'm finishing up a bunch of my best ball super flex drafts that I did, some slow drafts, and I got Carr in a few of those, and I've taken him in like the 20th. Those are 20 rounds over on Underdog. I've taken him in the 20th round on a couple of those, get him stacked up, and he's so cheap, and he's not even expected to miss time. So he is coming off a career high targets per out run last year. He had a solid season. It was about 18%. Prior to that, he wasn't much of a target earner. He did show a little flash of target earning last year. Again, it's similar to like the Jake Ferguson stuff we talked about earlier in the show, where it's more like he flashed target earning because there was no one else to really get it. Speaking of that, I mentioned that Kamara's efficiency wasn't great. He only played 13 games last year. 86 targets, 75 receptions in 13 games. It tied a career high for receptions per game last year. I don't want to draft a whole bunch of Alvin Kamara, and I don't think I've drafted him at all. I'm taking a lot of Kendre Miller. But if all the receivers are running deep every time and Derek Carr's answer was to just throw to Alvin Kamara all last year, maybe we should think about drafting some Alvin Kamara this year, Shawn, because he caught a ton of balls last year, and it seems possible that he just does that again. Again, Kendre Miller, it's one more reason that I get excited about Kendre Miller, because if he does take over this offense, I feel like there's going to be a lot of targets to the running backs. He's a cheaper way to play that even than Kamara. But it is a fascinating situation and discussion, and to hear you talk through some of their ancillary pieces as also being vertical targets, but also that Olave's lack of Yak is a really intriguing proposition, or at least consideration that I hadn't thought through. Loved getting your thoughts on that. It's a puzzle that I spent a decent amount of time on when I did the Saints projection, as I talked about, and you added a lot of clarity and color to, well, not necessarily clarity, a lot of color to it, but I don't know that we have any clarity on who's actually going to get those underneath targets. It's a fascinating question for fantasy football in 2024. I love your note about how the Saints crushed the Falcons in week 17. It brought me back to when the report out of Atlanta was that they would retain Arthur Smith, or they're planning to retain Arthur Smith. But I believe it was something like, unless the team loses out. And I remember I tweeted a couple weeks later that the Falcons players knew the assignment. They lost to the Bears by 20, then they lost to the Saints by 31 in their final 2 games to ensure that they did not win and have to retain Arthur Smith. Do you remember a couple years ago when everyone was defending Arthur Smith? We talked about him a lot on the show, but people were pointing to some reports out there that the players really liked him. I wonder, in hindsight, knowing that when a report came out that unless they lost out, they were going to keep Arthur Smith, and his players just quit in the way that players do when they don't want their coach to be retained. And they tell you right with their play, they tell their owner what they hope to see happen. I wonder, in hindsight, because there were those reports that his players loved him, if, his billionaire father and the likely media ties and those things had anything to do with those reports that the players all loved him. We talked at the time that we were sure that, Drake London and Kyle Pitts loved not getting targets and not getting to ply their trade and the thing that they worked so hard at. We made a lot of jokes about that. I mean, it's hard to imagine that the guys that can't actually go out there and do the things that they're paid to do love the coach that isn't allowing them to do it and is telling them that they should just be happy with run blocking. But yeah, we got that confirmation in December and January that the team was very comfortable losing those 2 games by a lot to not very great teams. Anyway, I just needed to gloat about that. We haven't gloated about that this summer yet. Not a fan of Arthur Smith at Stealing Bananas HQ. Do you have any other thoughts on the Saints?
No, the running back situation seems so clear that Kendre Miller is going to crush that I'm scared. Anytime it looks that good and you're drafting a lot, I don't know. There's a little bit of hope base there, and hope base
because he could just be bad.
Dangerous.
Pete
was mentioning to me that maybe some of the reports had gotten a little more negative. I haven't run across those, so they must somehow be. I don't know. I'm terrified, Ben, because I want that one so much. As you mentioned, Kendre Miller, if he ends up as the starter, is going to be the league winner for 2024. And he looked fantastic again in week 18. I mean, maybe you can't claim that Kendre Miller looked fantastic in week 18 when the defensive backs were completely olaying A.T. Perry.
We just got done saying that the Falcons quit on Arthur Smith, or I just got done saying that, I should say. I don't need to rope you in on my one-way beef with Arthur Smith, but I have been talking about how Kendre Miller, because of injuries, didn't get a chance to play a whole lot all year, got the starter in week 18 and looked great in that game. And I am having, as you say this, to reckon with the fact that his 5.6 yards per carry, the rushing TD, 13 carries, 73 yards. He had a catch on just 24 snaps. That maybe that's not as exciting as I want it to be if the Falcons were sort of letting him have quite a lot of that.
How about another NFC South squad here? You mentioned, but I couldn't believe I read this in the email. You mentioned that Adam Thielen is a decent pick, and I'm looking at your spreadsheet here and thinking he still isn't. I mean, give Xavier look at some credit. What's happening?
Yeah, so the Panthers are a fun one, and you talked about Ezekiel Elliott a little bit ago, and how those types of profiles don't necessarily mean that you need to pick them, that they're more like high floor. I was thinking, I should be clear, very specifically for best ball in relation to season long, where best ball, you still need to. One of the real challenges in best ball in an atmosphere, especially over on Underdog, where the receivers are going so high, you try to get as much receiver depth as you can early, but it's how do you build out the rest of your receivers? And just having guys that are going to run a lot of routes and play a lot and get a decent amount of targets can be helpful. It's the one format, or the one. We're not ageists, but we don't necessarily love the old guys necessarily. The best ball is the place where I've been a lot more comfortable settling for less exciting wide receivers, because the ability to just get the target volume and the usable weeks and that stuff can be relevant. I have not drafted Adam Thielen yet this year. The note specifically was because I've been very high on Deontay Johnson, and Deontay Johnson did come out high in my projections. I've been saying anywhere I could that I think when projections come out, he's going to look like he's 3 or 4 rounds undervalued. He started to climb already. I projected him not far off from like Christian Kirk, Jaden Reed. We were talking a little about you and me before the show. Not far behind Michael Pittman. The Colts thing is something we could talk about, Shawn, but it was fascinating to see in their projection. We talked about how Anthony Richardson really only started 2 games and played them all the way through. He started 4 games. The other 2, he left early after about a third of the game. He played about 2 2/3 games total, 2 1/3 and 2 full games. Week 1, they play fast and they throw a lot. Week 2, he gets hurt. Week 3, he's out. Week 4, they come back, and that's his other start that he plays the whole game, his second key start. They had a negative 21% pass rate over expected. They were slower paced. They came out and they said, we're going to be run heavy. We've talked about how the passing profile is not necessarily all the way there. Steichen being a fast-paced coach has been a really big discussion point, and rightfully so. But he went on to be fast-paced with Gardner Minshew. That next week, where Richardson was lost for good, they also were very run-heavy. They started out with a run-heavy game plan. Minshew plays the second half of that game. They get a little faster pace, a little more pass-heavy under Minshew the rest of the way. But I think we already maybe kind of saw that shift toward a really pass-heavy thing, set up for the Colts. When I went through their projections, I tried to think through how they're going to operate, what's going to happen. I wound up projecting them not as fast-paced as Steichen's history, because I do think it's going to be a run-heavy team, which lowers play volume. And I think the pass rate over expected could actually be a lot lower than people expect, that it's a really run-heavy Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson's mobility-based offense. But even though I projected him for a really good rushing line, I wind up projecting him for fewer than 4,000 passing yards. And this is something that people are just not doing in the modern fantasy football landscape. They are not considering that mobile quarterbacks still have to have some floor of passing. They just think mobility, fantasy points, go Burr, I'm going to draft this guy. I only projected him for 600 rushing yards and like 6 rushing TDs. There's a possibility he runs for 1,000 plus, I guess. But you need some passing production along with that. He winds up falling behind some pocket passers like Jordan Love and Brock Purdy in my projections. And so Michael Pittman is the other player that Deontay Johnson actually winds up very close with, even though Pittman's target share I projected much higher than Johnson's. I have Indy in terms of pass volume pretty low. And we've tried to talk through this with Michael Pittman this year, that last year we didn't even like the price when it got a little bit cheaper, mostly because the projected target volume was going to be a concern. He smashes last year his ADP, or does well, certainly, but that's with a different quarterback, a mobile quarterback, and how many dropbacks and more pass attempts due to the high number of dropbacks. And I mean, even if Pittman concentrates volume, which I think he will with the RPO heavy offense and some of those things we've talked about, it's tricky. But anyway, Deontay Johnson ends up looking really strong. I do project him well. I don't project him amazing. I only project him for a 24% target share. I project Pittman, for example, for a 27%. But factoring in that number for Deontay, I've got Leggett at 80 targets. He's a vertical high ADOT type of player. But the point about Thielen is there's just no one else here. Jonathan Mingo had a really disastrous year last year. He, to me, looks like just a backup to Leggett in that role at this point. Deontay Johnson's going to be the other outside receiver, and Thielen's going to be in the slot. You have Terrace Marshall here, too. I don't think he's going to factor in much. Jatavian Sanders is the tight end I'm projecting for the most usage, but they also have Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas. I don't know how much Sanders can do as a rookie right away. I am projecting him to have a little bit of a decent rookie season, or at least 56 targets is pretty solid for his draft capital and everything. Maybe I should expect a little bit more out of him. Maybe I should expect a little more out of Leggett. I only have Leggett for 80 targets at a high ADOT. But Thielen, I end up getting to 95 targets out of the slot. I move his target percentage way down from last season. And like I said, I have Deontay's up reasonably high. But the big takeaway for me was even if I project Deontay to come in and earn volume, which he's always done for the record. I've had people ask me, why do I think Deontay is just going to take all of Thielen's work? And to be clear, Thielen last year was good, but was very route dependent. He ran the fourth most routes of any wide receiver in the entire NFL. His targets per out run rebounded from some disastrous rates the prior 2 seasons to 21.4%, which for those who actually listen to the targets per out run numbers, and I know they can get a little numbing sometimes, but 21.4% is not that high for how many targets Thielen ultimately saw. He was very routes based last year, but that 21.4% for him was better than each of his 4 prior seasons. And nothing he's done anytime recently has been anywhere close to any of Deontay Johnson's recent seasons. Each of Deontay Johnson's past 4 seasons have been at least 1.5 percentage points higher than Thielen's 21.4%, which for him, again, was a 5-year high for him. So what I'm saying is Deontay Johnson, you have to go back to his rookie season to find a year where he didn't earn more targets per route than Thielen last season. Thielen's target share looks good because he ran so many routes, and Deontay's doesn't look great in his final year in Pittsburgh because he was hurt in week 1. He only played 43% of the snaps. He was slow in his return. They also faded his playing time late. He only played 48% in week 18. So his targets per game and target share in games played doesn't look as strong. But again, the per route number stayed strong for Deontay, and they've consistently every year of his career been better than anything that Adam Thielen has done recently. And I don't have a huge concern with Deontay Johnson's snaps being limited last year in certain games. Now that he's on a new team that went and acquired him to ostensibly be the number 1. So if Adam Thielen can run the 4th most routes in the NFL last year, I don't think Carolina is necessarily going to drop back as much as last year. I'm projecting that number to come down. But Deontay Johnson should run a lot of routes, should earn plenty of volume, is the target here, to be clear. But the note that I sent you was even after I project Deontay Johnson that way, and I feel like being solid with Leggett. Maybe I need to project a lot more Xavier Leggett, but that Deontay Johnson isn't a super low ADOT player necessarily. He's more of an intermediate player. Leggett feels like the deeper. And then Thielen is like the pretty low ADOT guy. I've got Thielen around an 8 ADOT, Deontay Johnson around a 10. The average wide receiver is about 11, so he's a slightly below average. Thielen's in tight end range. And Leggett, I have at 12.5, a higher ADOT than average. But Bryce Young didn't push the ball downfield a lot last year either. That's another reason I didn't come out really high on Leggett's rookie season target share. He could really just break out and smash. I mean, that's the part of the Leggett prospect profile that I'm maybe not weighing in is he had a really good final season. He's very athletic. Maybe he just is a meaningful hit right away. But, not wanting to push Bryce Young's ADOT too much higher than last year. Some of those things has kept me. Now that we're talking through it, Sean, I'm going to probably tweak and move Leggett up a little higher because Baker Mayfield's ADOT was a little higher than Bryce Young's in this Dave Canales offense. I was kind of thinking through this they don't really have a Mike Evans. That's part of why Baker was throwing downfield more, is you have Mike Evans, who's this vertical but target dominant high ADOT alpha. He's going to bring up any quarterback's, ADOT was what I was telling myself from a passing perspective. The Panthers don't really have that, but maybe what Evans is in the offense is almost certainly Leggett would be the guy that Canales would try to replicate as much of that as he could with. I certainly think the target distributions would be different. I don't think Leggett's going to lead the team in targets the way that Evans did in Tampa, but probably I'm understating just because of Bryce Young's propensity to throw underneath last year. I'm understating the potential for Leggett to really earn in a high A-dot role. It's probably more possibilities for him, but man, again, without a really big tight end presence, and Young didn't throw to the running backs much last year at all either. Both the running back and tight end rates were below average last year. Maybe he throws to the running backs a little bit more. That's another thing that Canales did in Tampa. I tried to think through this a lot, but I was like, I kind of keep coming back to the guy that was his comfortable blanket last year, Adam Thielen, is still on the team, is gonna still probably run a lot of routes out of the slot. Their focus is probably going to be to just get Bryce Young comfortable and doing things that he does well. And I mean, man, like Adam Thielen is part of that, comfortability. And one of the frustrating things last year about all Thielen's work was like the defenses didn't really seem to care. They were just giving the underneath targets to Thielen away because they weren't really productive plays necessarily. It was something that I think the Panthers, I argued at the time, I know it's stealing signals, the Panthers in a functional offense should be trying to replace those targets. I don't know if they've done enough to add enough to this passing game to where you replace those targets. It's almost like, the role Zach Ertz played early in Kyler Murray's career once they, acquired Zach Ertz. Oh, we're just going to give him this underneath dump off version, veteran player. I feel like Adam Thielen just running a bunch of 5-yard curls is going to happen again this year.
That would be disappointing. Certainly it's possible. I mentioned the NFL Pace tool earlier in kind of the full audio version of the show. And I don't think it surprises anybody that the Panthers ran easily the most total plays when trailing by 7+, threw easily the most passes per 60 minutes when trailing by 7+. If the team turns around a little bit this year, they could, see reduced overall passing volume. And yet when we're talking about vacated targets, or maybe you just, you lose your job targets, and specifically I should say routes, according to SIS, Jonathan Mingo 513 last year, DJ Chark 431. We have Hayden Hurst at 207. Ian Thomas has been the really buzzy guy because evidently he's looked good in workouts, but he just had the 61 targets last year, or again, 61 routes, way behind Tommy Tremble at 206. I mean, I think that you easily get Jatavian Sanders stepping into a big chunk of those tight end routes, even if Thomas does take a step forward. I mean, Hayden Hurst wasn't good. None of those guys really draw targets as a tight end. If your tight end actually did draw targets, that would cut into the plays a little bit. One of the things, as you describe everything that's happening here, that kind of jumps out for me is that even though the target depths were very different for Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen, I do think that what offenses are asking those guys to do has some similarity. And one of the things when we first got that big swap or flip from Juju Smith-Schuster to Deontay Johnson with Pittsburgh was just almost the revelatory nature of Deontay Johnson's route running and how, I mean, ridiculously easily he separates off the line of scrimmage. And so if you had Juju Smith-Schuster and you're watching those games and you're like, okay, well, Deontay's going to get some targets now, but like also Juju exists. Maybe he'll get some as well. And then Deontay is wide open before Juju has even like taken his third step. You're like, okay, well, Juju's not going to get any targets. This one dude is, almost transcendent in terms of that early separation. And I think that if you can do that, but also draw the targets at a little bit deeper, depth, then you don't have to throw so shallow. And that might be something in terms of the signing that to me feels like what the Panthers are looking for there. And then
for sure. So you're saying I should project. So I was trying I completely agree with that. Sorry to kind of cut in, but you're not even really making the case for Xavier Legette. I already was saying that I'm ahead of market on Deontay Johnson, but you're saying I should just project the 160 targets I've been saying might be possible for Deontay Johnson. That's the benchmark I've been using. I'm like, guys, there's a guy going in the 7th round that could maybe get 160 targets. That doesn't make any sense. I know I mentioned it on like ship chasing a couple times. I projected him for 134 here. Are you telling me that I need to get Adam Thielen's target number lower? I need to just go up to 150 on Deontay, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's competing with nobody.
Nobody.
It has to be Legette, who is the other guy there.
Mm-hmm.
I also do think that there is, if you want to draft Ian Thomas, you definitely can. I think that Sanders is going to be surprising to people as the season rolls around. I think that the tight end target depth has an overlap with what Thielen has done recently that is problematic for him. The other thing here, and you mentioned that the running back usage in Carolina versus Tampa, where the coach comes from, is very different. Rachaad White led the NFL in running back routes. And there were so many routes that even though he was actually quite a bit down in terms of target per route, that, he gets to the 66 targets. He creates, 531 yards. I would be shocked if the other element that doesn't overlap with Thielen is just Jonathan Brooks. And when you're dropping back and you're doing the play design and you're thinking, who do we want to get the ball in the hands of? It's like, is it a young 20s running back with explosive speed and game-breaking ability, the ability to make guys miss, or is it Adam Thielen? That also becomes a pretty easy choice. Now, not to say that it's necessarily easy to scheme these things up and get the right guys open, because certainly if the defense is trying to take people away and Adam Thielen is out there, they're like, yes, just let that guy catch these 3-yard passes and then tackle him. I have his target map up on the site, which you can get on his NFL Stat Explorer page. He caught 23 of 27 targets within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage on the left, 21 of 22 on the right. He's the perfect guy to go after if your league gives bonus points for extremely low depth receptions. But again, then you create, I think, this overlap with the backs. And even if Brooks isn't there, I think that we probably have, not in terms of where they're being drafted, but in terms of how we think about Hubbard and Sanders, I think those guys are bigger talents. Not that they're big talents, but they can play. Whereas we've talked about some teams that don't have a guy who can play. And so if you have injury concerns with Brooks, which, the really horrifying thing would be a re-injury, right? Something that takes him out of the second half of the season. I do think they have other bodies who can replicate some of what Rachaad White was doing.
I like those takes. It's been a fun one to talk through because I didn't want to be high on Adam Thielen. I was able to, literally while you were talking, move 11 targets away from him toward some Xavier Legette, some Jonathan Brooks, and some more Deontay Johnson, as well as shifting around some stuff so Jatavian Sanders could get a little bit bigger piece of the pie as well. I took some from Tommy Tremble. I like the idea. I was trying to figure out how to handicap the Panthers tight end situation, if it would take Sanders a little bit of time to really move into the number one role. I like the idea of just projecting him to break out there because we know Tremble and Thomas just aren't very good. And if Sanders is good, he should just play. Like, they need guys in the passing game, the way that you're talking through, like, who has to step up. Like, literally, if you can play, get on the field and run some routes. Like, that's where we're at. It's at least better than last year. We talked at this time last year that it was one of the worst receiving corps we'd ever seen assembled, and that it was going to be tough for Bryce Young. He still played bad despite that. We're not trying to make a bunch of excuses for him, but it is funny as I shifted around some of those targets. I don't have Legette or Sanders or even Deontay Johnson, certainly, who's not a hyper efficient player, projected for huge efficiency. But as I shifted around some of those numbers, it did boost Bryce Young's efficiency a little bit. It's kind of funny to watch that in real time where it's like, you start to take out the Adam Thielen targets and maybe things get a little bit more efficient for him if he does have other guys that are efficient players in their own rights. And I've talked about this before. It's not, the projection is just a spreadsheet, but it's not crazy to think through whether a quarterback can do some different things, in terms of passing efficiency and that stuff relative to, whether he has good receivers that are capable of elevating that. I mean, that just makes sense, right? I mean, it's certainly not crazy, but I'm thinking back to the year that the Eagles added AJ Brown, and I put in all red in my notes. I needed to double check Jalen Hurts' passing efficiency. It was like way higher than his previous career high. It was, but I didn't know what else to do because he had multiple efficient receivers now. Devonta Smith also an efficient receiver, and I still drafted only Trey Lance over Jalen Hurts everywhere I could, or at a cheaper price than Jalen Hurts. It turned out that Jalen Hurts did break all of his efficiency metrics. It was right there in the projections. I had made this bright red note. It was the only note that I highlighted in red, and on any team sheet I've written about this at Stealing Signals, I just didn't act on it. But that's not where we're at with Bryce Young, to be clear. Bryce Young's efficiency still doesn't look great in my projection, but it does start to go up when I start to shift targets away from Adam Thielen, which is a pretty good barometer for what they should want to be doing as an offense as well. As you were talking through, all of the Thielen catches were right there around the line of scrimmage. What do you want to be doing? You want to be getting the ball to Jonathan Brooks' hands and hoping that Jatavian Sanders is this breakout tight end for you into the hands of Xavier Legette if you can. However, down the field, maybe wide receiver screens, right? Thielen's still going to be out there running routes. Hearing you talk about it got me more comfortable cutting his target share even more. For the record, I mean, he had 137 targets last year. I had already cut him more than 40 targets, but we've cut him now 50.
He's in that age and play range where you tend to, not that you can't have a decline, but a pure collapse is very possible.
Yeah, and that's right. And that was one of the things that was good to see for him, but difficult to see as fantasy managers who didn't have a lot of Adam Thielen last year, was the element where he was able to reverse some of the stuff in his targets per route, because that had already kind of in some ways happened the year prior. In his final year in Minnesota, he had really fallen to targets per route run and yards per target levels. He had a 1.06 yards per route run the year prior. I mean, his prime, he was a 2+ yards per route run guy. He was half of that in terms of, the route. And you see the steady decline from his peak in 2016 to 2018 is really his per route run peak. He's still really good in 2019 and 2020. And then 2021, it starts to drop. 2022, it really craters. And then it rebounds last year. It's still not even as good as 2021, the per route run stuff. The yards per route run is still not as good, but his routes are so high as well. I mean, good for him to pull out another good season, but that decline had mostly already happened. And then, yes, he was good, but it's a lot easier to then predict the decline to happen again, so to speak. If it was like last year, you just kind of turned back the clock a little bit in a very specific role in a dysfunctional offense. But the point I'm trying to make is just to further emphasize what you shared some great stats on, that he's probably not adding a ton other than the amount of routes that he was given last year, which were, again, 4th in the NFL. He's probably going to lose a lot of routes this year. He'll be their slot guy, but he's an older slot guy. He's not going to play on every down. Deontay Johnson's going to be out there. They have a guy that they went and got to be the number one and run the routes. Deontay Johnson's going to run more routes than Adam Thielen this year. I feel very confident in that. So, yeah, it impacts how the whole thing looks. Whether it's per route, whether it's, the raw numbers, etc. When you think through the offense, what they're trying to do, what they have to do, there's still an element of it, Shawn, where it's like he's still going to be out there some, and he does have that little bit of a connection with Bryce Young. It's probably more first half of the season stuff, because you'd think the Jatavian Sanders, Xavier Legette, Jonathan Brooks stuff all hopefully evolves throughout the season as a collective unit, especially. But I mean, Adam Thielen's going to have like a 9-target game in week 3. I'm just putting it out there. It's going to happen like early in the season. And people are going to be like, oh, we should have drafted more Adam Thielen.
Well, one of the things that I think could happen as well, even with how bad he was, they can't be completely ready to give up on Jonathan Mingo. And you're basically not projecting anything for him. And maybe that is something that also clears up early. But I think during this time period where maybe you aren't getting as much Sanders. Maybe Brooks is, not even active. I would think that's kind of the experimental time period, that first month, where they're like, if we force some routes and targets to Mingo, can he take a next step? Because, for the same reasons, unfortunately, that you really don't want Thielen to take targets away from Deontay Johnson, who's going to be a more efficient player. If you could get both Mingo and Leggett to deliver a more vertical presence and to capitalize on that athleticism, because it in a very weird sort of way, they saw the Mingo miss last year and they went back to a very similar profile in Xavier Leggett. Now, I mean, maybe Mingo had a better chance to break. I mean, Mingo wasn't guaranteed to be a bust. I mean, he could have hit with that profile, and they could hit with Leggett with that profile. But I do think they still have to experiment with him a little bit to see, if this new and theoretically better coaching staff is able to unlock something from him. I guess I don't actually think, and I get in trouble with these things sometimes because it just seems so clear to me and so logical based on what you need to have from a in-game tactics perspective and from a roster development perspective. If you have the tactics for individual games and you have roster building both pointing in the same direction, and that direction is, let's explore what Mingo can bring before these other guys are ready. We've got this little window. I have a hard time working back to the fact that that's not necessarily what's going to happen. So I don't want to in any way, shape, or form be like, oh, I mean, Adam Thielen's not even going to be out there on the field. I do think there's some potential for him to not get routes on top of not drawing targets. And that would be, again, thinking through his fantasy profile, that would be a dagger.
It would be. And that's when we talk about the narrow moats and everything on one of the earlier episodes of this long episode, earlier shorts episode. Certainly he's going to be one of those guys. There's just not a ton of competition. I think from a veteran standpoint, Shawn, from like a leadership standpoint, what he is in the locker room, I'm thinking through a lot of those things. His relationship with Young, which obviously was there on the field with the heavy targeting last year.
Yeah, when you check in on the Panthers, I mean, Thielen is the guy who's being quoted by the reporters. This isn't somebody who doesn't have a role in the building and on the team and all that.
That's the thing. That's where it comes. Like for me, it's like, so, and you said, you think through and I want to emphasize this point because I loved it, that, we think through the stuff that actually makes the most sense for the team, on the field, the tactical elements and it doesn't make sense, but they're also not trying to win the Super Bowl this year. You know what I mean? Like this is the type of team that runs a veteran out there because they're trying to get the rookie quarterback comfortable. And I mean, yeah, I just, everything I've ever heard about Thielen, like off the field and stuff, is that teammates love him and he's a leadership. He's a leader. He's the kind of guy that, so anyway, I don't want to say that, he doesn't deserve it or whatever, but there are other things that sometimes do play into these situations. Just trying to establish a culture, new coach, you let the veteran leader in year one be a part of all of that, even when he's maybe not the best player in the field. But the point that you made there that I wanted to emphasize, and you said, you get into trouble with this. Sometimes I get into trouble with it. Sometimes I think we get, the criticism is like, we just kind of root for the things that we want to see happen. And they don't always happen that way. We just want the young players to play and this and that. It's a fair criticism in some cases. I would argue that we have, in a lot of ways, leveraged that for a lot of important hits. Thinking through what the teams actually should be wanting to do is, I think, a very viable analysis. It's not just looking at last year's target numbers. And that's why, I did want to talk through Carolina with you a little bit, because I did do their projection and get a little concerned about how Thielen might fit in terms of, not having any exposure to him and all this stuff. At his cost, he could be a veteran addition in best ball builds, and maybe he still will be a decent one, but probably not by the end of the season. Probably he's not playing a lot. I mean, he could very well get hurt. We talked about the age cliff. There's a lot, like the production could just fall off so much. There's a lot of reasons to not necessarily be on him. I was like, Mingo was really bad last year. Just everything. The yards per target were sub 5. I mean, like you looked at I talked about the depth adjusted, efficiency stuff. I mean, his was just really catastrophic. I mean, not just not good, but just to emphasize, like, it wasn't good. It was bad. So yeah, they might continue to try to use him. But I do think the element where they drafted Leggett to sort of just replace him is sort of the way that I was thinking about it. That it would be kind of an either or with those two playing alongside Deontay and Thielen for the most part. But I think you're right. They'll try to work Mingo in as well. And as things progress throughout the season, maybe we do get less Thielen. But that point about thinking about what the team actually wants to do is so important for also when we talk about like the chaos of an NFL season and not just relying on projections, which is just the information we have for week one, essentially. Like, I'm saying Adam Thielen's going to play a lot in week one. You're saying he probably won't by week 17 because the team's going to figure it out between those 4 months, right? Like, they have to self-evaluate every week. And at a certain point, Adam Thielen is just not going, even if he's healthy, is not going to be the right guy to keep running out there. And you don't want to have a player on your team that was good for the first 3 or 4 weeks and then doesn't doing, I mean, not even good necessarily, but was running routes and then is not necessarily even running the routes anymore, as you said. I think those are all really strong points. And thinking through what the team might actually do, like I said, we're not always going to be right about it. We're not always going to be right about anything. There's a lot of things we're going to miss on, but thinking through what the team actually should do and what's in their best interest of doing is one of, I think, the most important ways to try to think through how things could progress in season. Because you get a lot of pushback that's like, obviously the team's going to do X. Obviously they're going to play the veteran Thielen. I was just giving you that pushback. But trying to think through how things can progress over the course of a season. It's 4 months of games. You want to think about what's in their best interest. What the coaches want their teams to do well. And I think Dave Canales has tried to set up his players to do well throughout his career, and he's done well. That's why he got the head coaching job. He did well at the Bucs and with Seattle in his last couple stops. He's going to make decisions, I think, ultimately, especially as the season goes along, that put his players in the best positions to succeed. That includes putting your best receivers on the field or guys that could potentially have upside to be your best receivers in the case of like a Mingo. Maybe he comes back and hits. I think pretty quickly you're going to see that Adam Thielen's not adding a lot of value and it's not helping Bryce Young to just have this guy out there. So anyway, I thought you put that very, very well, and I just wanted to defend that type of thinking where you were saying sometimes we get in trouble thinking about what almost we want or we think is best. I also think we sometimes find some good answers doing that. And it is a logical way of thinking.